I've titled this presentation, Time for a, quote, hard reset, revisioning education for equity. So I want to start off by just talking about what I call a tale of four pandemics. Now, people are in the audience probably going, four? We got our hands full with one. What does she mean, four? Well, let me just give you an idea of what I see as the four pandemics that our young people are facing. The first is the one you know very well, the novel coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, whatever you call it. It's the one that has placed the entire world in a kind of lockdown mode that we are finally starting to come out of. But our young people are also facing another pandemic, and that is a pandemic of racism. Now, somebody is probably saying, wait a minute, it may be endemic because it's all over the US, but it's not necessarily pandemic. It's not all over the world. Well, I refute that, because when this incident in Minneapolis occurred with Officer Chauvin, with his knee on George Floyd, I started getting responses from people in places like the UK telling me, oh, you think this only happens in the United States? You should see what happened in the Stephen Lawrence case here in the UK. I got responses from folks in Paris, in France, saying, do you see what we do to Francophone Africans here? And particularly if they are of the Muslim faith. I got responses from people in Canada who said, you know, every time something happens in the US, you guys want to run to Canada, but it's not all you think it is. We have discovered 700 skeletal remains of children of Indigenous people. Even in Australia, colleagues and friends contacted me saying, you should see how we have pushed the Indigenous across this continent. So yes, it is pandemic. Almost everywhere you go, you see this flood of racism. The third one has to do with the economic downturn. And in many ways, it is linked to COVID-19, but it still is international because we're in a global economy. Something like 2.8 million women left the economy in the midst of COVID, and people still haven't recovered. You guys know in California that it is almost impossible to find housing and that your homeless crisis has exploded. The notion that some families have not been able to find work post-COVID has put them in such a downward spiral. And it is pandemic because when people on this side of the world don't buy goods and services, people on other parts of the world can't produce them. So we're all caught in this. And then finally, one that you are very familiar with, you know it's not a hoax, and that is the coming climate catastrophe. From the fires that you've suffered in the past year to the flooding that you've experienced with this sort of atmospheric rivers. The whole world is changing. It is pandemic. It's everywhere. In an international study of young people starting at ages 16, going to about 25, their number one concern is climate change. And their concern linked to that is that the adults in the room, people like you and I, aren't going to do anything about it. But I want to suggest that pandemics is not all gloom and doom. It sounds like it. But the brilliant novelist Arundhati Roy actually came up with a beautiful, beautiful essay called The Pandemic is a Portal. And I just want to share with you a piece of it that resonates with me, and I think speaks to what you are confronting as you are out in schools, out in communities, as a part of your residencies or as preparing people for their residencies. And she argued that historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or, and that little word or is really important, we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. It's those last two sentences that I want to hang most of my remarks on. We can walk through lightly. We don't have to keep doing what we've been doing. And we can imagine another world. We can imagine another way to educate. But that last sentence is the kicker here. We have to be ready to fight for it. So, all during the pandemic, we kept hearing the notion, oh, we got to get back to school. There was such concern about what being away from school was doing to our kids. And I agree, it created a level of isolation and mental and social emotional health concerns that we had not seen. But what did getting back mean? And for me, the last thing that I wanted to do was get back to normal. So I've argued, let's not go back to normal. For me, that's the point of what I've called the education reset. Now, where did I get this notion of reset from? Well, I'm sure every single one of you have one of these in your pocket, some form, whether it is Android or Apple, you've got one. Some of you don't have it in your pocket. You got it in your hand right now because you got to stay connected to your office or you're waiting for an important message. But you also know that because they're machines, they don't work perfectly. Sometimes they don't do the things we needed them to do. And so we try to, muck around with them to fix them. We might pull the SIM card out and blow it clean, or we might check the battery, make sure the contacts are working. We might just shut it down, let it rest for a while, see if we can get it back up. But if we can't get it fixed, we march ourselves down, or even we might try a support group, get online, see what those folks say. But if we can't do any of those things, we march ourselves down to the place we got it, to our wireless provider, to the store where you bought the actual phone. And somebody who looks probably all of 17 years old wearing a t-shirt says to you, I think it's time for a hard reset. Well, if you're like me, that is the kiss of death. Why is it the kiss of death for me? Because I'm terrible about backing my phone up. So it means everything that's on that phone is about to get wiped. So all those pictures of the food that that restaurant you went to and you wanted everybody to see, I had this appetizer, they made this dessert, all of the selfies you took with friends and loved ones, that stuff's gone unless you backed it up. And what you're going to get back is a device that is a lot like it was when you got it from the factory. It's going to be clean and you get to start again. That's the metaphor that I have been using for what we need to do as we think about a, quote, post-pandemic schooling. Now, I wish I could say I was smart enough to have thought of this on my own, but I actually thought of it by looking back at history. Yes, I confess, I used to be a history teacher. I used to teach U.S. history. When I was in Pennsylvania, I taught Pennsylvania history. When I was in California, I taught California history. So I always see the world through historical lenses. And so one of the lessons that I was able to garner from history comes from things that happened in post-World War II. These are two pictures post-World War II. On the left of your screen is a picture of post-war Japan. And, you can't imagine that this is a nation that ravaged by the first dropping of atomic bombs just started up school one day and said, okay, well, let's just get back and where did we leave off? No, they thought long and hard about what we need to do differently. So one of the things that they did differently was they expanded education opportunities for girls. I don't know if you've ever been to Japan. It still remains a very gendered society. But they did say we've got to make sure that we educate girls. The second change they made is they looked to the West and they realized that their organization of elementary, secondary didn't pay close enough attention to those middle grades. And so they began forming middle schools. That was a big shift for them, that let's not put these pre-teens or early adolescents in big high schools. And all of us know that there is something developmentally different about early adolescence. So they took a lesson from the West. The picture on the right side is also a post-World War II picture from the losing side. This one is Italy. And it is a picture from the Reggio Emilia preschool, which today is regarded as the best preschool model in the world. In fact, here in Wisconsin, we send preschool candidates to Reggio Emilia so that they can see it, because their concern was somehow they had got sucked into fascism and that their children had not grown up to be able to solve problems. They succumbed to the authoritarian regime. So you see a picture of a little boy trying to solve a problem. The teacher is not solving it for him. So those are two examples. I'm not suggesting that we have to have a world war to change, at least I hope not. But I will tell you that when there are catastrophic events, as bad as they are opportunities to change and improve. So some of you will remember Katrina. A lot of people were just jumping up and down after Katrina saying, we got to get back to normal. We got to get back to normal. But if you remember, particularly in New Orleans, in Orleans Parish, normal was already terrible. Why would you want to go back to those terrible schools? And that was often the response of the education establishment. Let's go back to normal. There was another group of people, more neoliberal, so-called reformers, who had another idea. Now, I'm not endorsing their idea. What I'm saying is, if you have this portal to go through, you're either try to do what you already did, or someone will come up with a new idea. And sometimes that new idea is not to your advantage. I want us to be thinking carefully about what our new ideas can be, because what happened in New Orleans ends up in the loss of a public school system. You now have an entirely chartered school district. And I'm not making a statement about charters being, quote, bad. I'm saying it is bad not to have a public school system. So we've got to begin to think about, as we go through this portal, and I think your residency program is a wonderful example of how you could do things differently. How we do things differently, not just for the sake of doing them differently, but for the sake of making them better. So for more than 30 years, I've been doing something called culturally relevant pedagogy. You may recognize it from this now third edition of this book. I call it the book that will never die, because I did the book in '94 and I keep having to revise because the demand is there. So this past year, we put out a third edition. Or if you're kind of an education research nerd like I am, then you may know it from this article that came out in 1995 called Towards a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. I'm going to give you a kind of brief overview of what this looks like. Hopefully it's the kind of work that will be helpful for your teacher candidates and your residency programs. But I want you to get this particular image in your mind around culturally relevant pedagogy, and that is of an equilateral triangle. You remember from geometry that it's equal sides, equal angles. And you know, if you take any side or any angle away, you no longer have a triangle. So what's at each of these angles of the triangle? Well, something called academic achievement, but more specifically, student learning. Something called cultural competence, and a third thing called sociopolitical or critical consciousness. Let me walk you briefly through each of them. And I'm saying briefly because I've literally done 3-day-long sessions on each one individually, so this really is quick. Supporting student learning seems like a no-brainer. It seems like that's the reason why we pay teachers. That's what they're supposed to do. But I will tell you that we get caught up in arguments of depth versus coverage. You know, do we go really deep on an idea, or do we try to cover the syllabus? Do we try to cover the course guide? Do we try to cover the framework? Do we try to cover the textbook? That's one of those arguments I don't think we're going to solve. But I do want us to understand that we need to move away from the notion that because you have a high failure rate, your courses are rigorous. Maybe a high failure rate means you're not very good at teaching, because our students should be able to master whatever it is that we offer them. And so the image I want you to think about is that for many years, we used this image of the sieve. We put all the kids in and we push, 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 and only the ones that came out on the other side, we treated as worthy. We moved them on to honors or AP or gifted and talented or the high class. And everybody left in that sieve was basic. I want us to move away from that image of what we do to an image of a net. So not a sieve, but a net, that student learning. If we're going to support student learning, we have to have the image that we're going to catch every single student. Might sound unrealistic, but that needs to be our goal. Can you imagine an EMT worker saying before they head off to a fire, well, let's go see if we can save some of these people? That's not their mandate. Let's go see if we can save them all. And I actually am crazy enough to believe that there are some fields in which we can have zero tolerance for failure. Think about airline pilots. I'm on airplanes a lot. I cannot imagine showing up at the gate and hearing the gate agent say, well, you know, we got a few bad apples in the cockpit. Trust me, if that's what they got in the cockpit, they don't have me as a passenger. I'm going back home. I actually feel that way about policing. See, if you get to carry a sidearm and you have the power of life and death, we can't have a few bad apples. Policing requires everybody to serve and protect. And guess what? I feel this way about teaching. Now somebody's going, no, she's really crazy. But I do. I think you as a teacher have the power of life and death. It's not like being shot in the street, but it's the slow death that our young people are dying because they don't have good teachers throughout. Teaching isn't for everybody. And I know we're having teaching shortages, but I am seeing us really kind of reduce ourselves to, oh, did you graduate from high school? Or have you had some work experience? Oh, you can be a teacher. No, you can't. We can't catch all of our students if we don't put teachers in classrooms who are prepared to catch them all. They have to think of their work as ensuring that students learn. The second component is perhaps the most misunderstood: cultural competence. And what I mean by misunderstood is that people think, oh, I need to learn this list of do's and don'ts with this group of people. That isn't how it works. You know, here in Wisconsin, we have the third largest group of Hmong immigrant families. First largest is in California, second, Minnesota, third, Wisconsin. The first group of Hmong immigrants were people who were born in Laos and raised in Laos and came over to the States eventually. The second generation was born in Laos, but pretty much raised in transition in places like the Philippines and other parts of the Pacific before they got to California. The third generation of Hmong immigrants was born here and raised here. So think about the fact that that third generation can't even really talk to their grandparents. One of the most popular courses on my campus is Hmong 101, with young people wanting to learn their native language. So cultural competence is not no list that you have is going to work, because the transitions and the changes in the culture are happening so fast. So what then is cultural competence? It's the ability to be firmly grounded in your own culture of origin and fluent in at least one other culture. So how does that happen? School is the place that can happen. Our job is to affirm the culture that students bring with them, but also help them develop fluency in another culture. Now, typically for students of color, that other culture is going to be what we think of as mainstream US culture. But this doesn't mean that white students are off the hook. They're not going to have the luxury of being in culturally encapsulated worlds. They're going to work in multinational corporations. My youngest son works in Silicon Valley, but his clients are in Taiwan and Japan and Korea. They're also in France and Germany and Austria. He has to have some cultural fluency to keep doing his work. And that's part of what our work is. And then third is the socio-political consciousness or critical consciousness. And I have Jefferson here, and we can talk about the problematics of Thomas Jefferson. He's a very complex character, trust me, full of contradictions like most of us. But this statement that he makes here really grabbed me. He says, above all things, I hope the education of the common people will be attended to, convinced that on their good sense, we may rely with the most security for the preservation of a due degree of liberty. Now, with our 2023 sensibilities, that doesn't seem like a very radical statement. But can I tell you, in 1787, when he made it, it was radical. Why? Because the common people were not educated. If you were one of the common people, you educated your kids based on what you did. If you were a farmer, guess what? Your kids were farmers. If you're a candle maker, your kid would be a candle maker. Sometimes you might have swapped off your kid with a friend who was a blacksmith, and your kid would go over there and become an apprentice. But be educated? No. So here's Jefferson writing in a letter to James Madison, is I think everybody ought to be educated. That is the crux of what we do. It's not about getting jobs, although we do want our students to be gainfully employed. But the real reason you have an education in a democratic society is to preserve the democracy. So let me talk a little bit about, these things shifted. It should say the evolution of culturally relevant pedagogy. One of the questions I often ask in person is how many people are on Twitter. Now I think I probably would ask how many on TikTok, but maybe not allowed to be on TikTok because maybe your school won't let you use TikTok. But what my point in asking about the platforms is that it's really where our students live. They're out there in cyberspace. And often I go in schools and see signs like this, that you can't have a cell phone. Now, I'm sure most of you would have been insulted if we began this session and I asked Dr. Olson, collect all the cell phones. Oh, you would have left. You would have left because they're a lifeline. And the real crux of the matter is our young people don't even use them as cell phones. If you check their call logs, they don't make that many calls. It's not a cell phone for them. It's a computer. They are texting. They are posting on social media. They are getting information via Google and other search engines. And yet we haven't figured out ways to integrate that technology successfully into our classrooms. You should know that during COVID, however, more than 35% of African-American children This was how they got their school information because they didn't have Wi-Fi at home. They didn't have high-speed Wi-Fi. They'd use the phones. So these are crucial technological tools that as we go through this portal, we need to be able to leverage. So the new digital divide that our society is facing is not black, white, or rich, poor. It really is generational. That we, as that older generation, haven't figured out how to successfully leverage the technology. So this work that I did beginning in 1989 with these dream keepers was one in which I saw teachers who did a wonderful focus on cultural history, doing things like revealing the things that their textbooks and their state frameworks may have omitted, excuse me. They focused on community issues like urban renewal. In this particular district I worked in, there was a VA hospital, and there were veterans' concerns they took up. They took up homelessness, all good stuff to get our kids involved in. But excuse me, they had a limited focus on student culture. Only one teacher used rap lyrics to teach poetry. For the most part, student culture wasn't integrated. But if you're going to call yourself a dream keeper today, then you're going to have to include popular culture to your understanding of culture. Youth culture is so important to our young people. We have to recognize hip hop's longevity and power. Whoops, somebody said, what? What did she say? What's she talking about? Some of y'all are in this room saying what people said 50 years ago, and incidentally, hip hop is 50 years old this year. When it first came out, you were saying, it's not gonna last. That stuff ain't gonna last. Well, we're 50 years into not lasting. It's here to stay. And we need to catch up with Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue has always figured out the pulse of the society because they want to sell things. They're looking to have consumers. So you will see on this particular, I hope we get this to work. This is a 1992 Fruity Pebbles commercial.
You watch me get Fred's Fruity Pebbles.
Who are you?
I'm the master rapper and I'm here to sing. I love Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
He loves Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
The bedrock yellow, orange, purple, lime, and red. But to get the fruity taste, I gotta trick Fred. Fruity.
To get the fruity taste, he's got to trick Fred. Barney.
Guess that's a wrap.
Oh, Fruity Pebbles cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast. Yabba-dabba delicious.
So this is 31 years ago that Madison Avenue leveraged popular culture. You have Barney invoking Run DMC with a pork pie hat and wraparound sunglasses and a gold chain. You have Fred scratching on a recorder. And in fact, I don't know if you noticed, but Barney had on a pair of Adidas. When have we seen the Flintstones wearing shoes? I mean, they work in a quarry and they don't wear shoes. But here, picking up on those elements of popular culture, they have leveraged it to sell a product. They did it then, and they still do it.
You watch me.
Oops. Okay.
Hello? Yeah. I can't find it. I'm looking for it right now. One second, buddy.
They say quit, they say done. They say we're too grown for fun. They say old, we say young. We say playful's never done. Don't fight the feeling, just let it flow. Stack it up, rack it up, let it go. Laughter is calling, pick up the phone. Let's stay playful, Oreo. Everyone's welcome, don't need a label. If we're still smiling, the future's bueno. I got a secret the world should know. Let's stay playful, Oreo.
Hello? Side.
And when you do, every day's full. For every moment, we're grateful. No half, our glass all the way full. Yeah, yup, stay playful.
So Nabisco has figured out how to sell Oreos using Wiz Khalifa. But somehow we as curriculum specialists and expert pedagogues haven't figured out how to take those things that are part of kids' everyday experiences, things that they like to do, and help build it into our teaching and learning. I want to now switch to the questions that, having been in the midst of COVID-19, pose for us if we're trying to implement a culturally relevant approach to teaching. So I asked the question, what does all of this mean in a post-COVID-19 racial injustice protest? Because I'm thinking two of the significant things that come together is the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the issue of racial injustice and people's response. What does it mean? So I start out with remembering what happened post-Katrina. What kinds of things do we have to begin to think about when you have a shift like this? What are some of the changed assumptions that we now deal with? So, for example, who can have access to digital devices? Do you remember before COVID, when we talked about making sure all kids had a computer technology, we said, oh, we can't give those kids computers because they're going to break them. They're going to sell them. They're going to lose them. Yeah, they are a couple, but for the most part, they're going to do what you asked them to do. We figured out we could give those Chromebooks out. And how important are things like the tests? You know, we went about a year without doing a test, and it wasn't the end of the world. We just kind of give the test on autopilot, right? Without thinking about what are we actually learning from these tests? What's the role of social emotional learning and mental health needs? Those things hadn't risen to the forefront. And yet, in this year alone, think about how many school shootings we have seen. And almost every time it traces back to someone's, not just their access to guns, which is really the number one problem, but also their mental health states. And how do we just begin to rethink education? So let me go back through those three elements and ask some specific questions. What does all this mean for student learning? Number one, what counts as learning? I want to be clear to you, there's certain terms that just rub me the wrong way. And one of those terms is, quote, learning loss. Stop saying that. The brain does not lose learning. Two conditions under which you lose learning: traumatic brain injury and dementia. Other than that, the brain is always learning things. Even though our kids weren't in schools, they were still learning. What they experienced was not learning loss, they experienced learning opportunities losses. They didn't have the chance to be in classrooms with peers and with caring adults. And then I want us to think about, how do we really measure what students know or assess what they know versus what they have? We constantly give kids credit for what they have, not what they know. Case in point, you ever been to a science fair? The kids at the science fair who bring something, you get a fourth grader who has brought this experiment that under no circumstances could that kid have done by himself. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, you learn that the kid's father is a physicist at the local university. Oh, okay, now that's explaining it a lot, right? But we still let them get the ribbon and win because of what they have, not what they know. Can we finally put these tests that we do have to give in their proper perspective? I'm really not an anti-test person, but I'm someone who believes the tests tell us something. It doesn't tell us everything. If tests were the be-all, end-all in this society, the best drivers on our road would be 16 years old because they passed the test. You and I both know these people cannot drive. Not a one of them. They can't drive. So the tests tell us something, they don't tell us everything. And linked to that, I asked the question, can we measure academic progress? I have that in big caps versus fixed external standards. Now, what do I mean by that? Imagine a teacher who is teaching 5th grade. She has a youngster who comes into her class reading at a 2nd grade level. But by the end of the year, that youngster is reading at a 4th grade level. He won't meet the standard, grade level standard, because he's not at 5th grade. He's at 4th. But he has progressed 2 years under the care of a careful and well-prepared teacher. Do we give him any, and do we give the teacher any credit for that amount of progress? It's what we call growth measures. So yes, we've got some fixed external standards. We say this is what 5th grade reading looks like. But if someone has made 2 years growth in 1 year, how do we reward that? How do we come to think about that? When we think about cultural competence, again, for me, what's the role of youth culture? Not just what their culture of origin is, but what is the stuff that they are producing and creating, and how do we integrate that into our teaching and learning? What's the role of socioeconomic differences? Just because youngsters are of a particular racial or ethnic group doesn't mean they're all the same. A middle-class Black child has a different experience than a working class or a poor Black child. And what's that role? How do we help our teachers understand disparity? If you have youngsters who are without homes, trust me, the teacher's homework assignment is not the priority. The priority is, where are we staying tonight? What are we going to eat? And then what's the role of digital literacy? If we are not going to incorporate these technologies, why do we even have them? I learned some years ago to always create a class hashtag. I have all these technologies in the classrooms I teach in. I have a whiteboard in every one. It's all connected to stuff. I created a hashtag for every class, and I created a Twitter account so that the students can then just insert their responses or how they're thinking about something. Guess what happened in the midst of this? I get a number of students, international students, who are not used to the sort of almost assertive or / aggressive way Americans interact in classrooms. So they don't blurt out answers. They don't participate in the conversations. They're very, very silent because they're used to a classroom in which the teacher has all the authority and they just sit there. But once I started incorporating the class hashtag, some of my Korean students, some of my Chinese students began to really be a part of the conversation. Part of why they didn't want to raise their hands or say anything is that they're not confident of expressing themselves in English. But if you've only got 135 characters, although I think Twitter gives you a little bit more now, you can say a few things and not worry about the grammar, not worry about sounding, quote, stupid. What's the role of digital literacy as we prepare our students? And then in terms of the critical consciousness, what are the kinds of questions we need to be engaging? I think sometimes we just keep doing what we've been doing without questioning any of it. And how do we help the public understand our changing needs? For a small segment of COVID, we had the public on our side, but now we've lost them again. We talk about social emotional learning, but for what social emotional learning do we prepare? There's a expression that I've heard people use, and they say, oh, because of COVID, we're all in the same boat now. Not true. We were all in the same storm. But some people rode this storm out on a luxury liner. They had their computers, they went home with their ring lights, they put up the green screens, they never missed a beat, they never missed a paycheck. But there were other people who were literally holding on to a piece of driftwood. needing the state to help pay their rent, needing resources from pantries to eat. So when we say SEL, not everybody needs the same thing. And then specifically, how do we help our students cope with what I'm calling pandemic trauma? So it's not just the social emotional that we all experience, the isolation and the sense of disconnectedness. Some of our students actually experience death very close up. I believe close to 250,000 parents of school-age children die as a result of COVID. Now, if we just kind of smooth out that average and say that each of those parents had about 2 kids, we know it varies. That's 500,000 children who are in our schools without a parent. Now, I know some people say, oh, well, our kids, we live in this particular community, our schools, and so our kids are not strangers to death. You're right. They probably aren't. But what they are strangers to is death without ritual. So the pandemic came and the funeral director said you can only have 7 people at the funeral. Or the minister said you can only have 10 people at this homegoing ceremony. Or the cemetery said, well, you can have 20 people, but they have to be spread 6 feet apart. Those rituals are important, and our kids are carrying that trauma with them. For those of you who have ever been to an African-American funeral, you know that, first of all, we don't call it a funeral, we call it a homegoing. And you know that repast is what this thing is about for us. See, because the funeral doesn't matter to the deceased, it matters to the living. And so without having that opportunity to celebrate that life, to tell those stories, to make those promises, we always tell a lie. We're going to stop just getting together around funerals, y'all. We're going to get together. No, you're not, but you say it, right? But that whole ritual of death was interrupted, and yet our kids are carrying that trauma. Let me begin to close out. I want to make sure I have some time for you to ask any questions, because I know I've thrown a lot at you. That I think we did learn some things from COVID, and I hope we'll take advantage of them. The first thing I think we learned is that relationships matter. Kids did not miss math packets. Okay? They missed peers and they missed caring adults. That is a crucial thing. And so now what are you doing to leverage relationships as we come out of this? We also learned that time can be a variable. We're so stuck on credit hour as a way to measure student progress, but we can learn to be more flexible in how we use time. COVID, sometimes you were at 8 and 9 o'clock doing stuff. Before COVID, end of the school day, don't call me, I'll be here tomorrow, I'm not answering no emails. You didn't have that luxury. Time really was, and for teenagers, oh my gosh, when you told them that we're going to meet later in the day, they loved it because they don't want to get up anyway. So the idea that we can be much more flexible with time, I think, is something that we've got to consider. Let me go back once with that also. The other thing I want you to think about when you say time can be a variable is I'm now saying to folks, there's no such thing as after school. I sit on a lot of community boards, the Urban League, the United Way, the Madison Community Foundation, the Madison Children's Museum, and most of them have some after-school programming. And I've been telling them there is no after school. You have to find ways to push into schools. Maybe as an organization, you can say to teachers, I'll take half of your class. While you do this, we're going to do this kind of thing with them. I'll tell you who does this very well, and I don't know if anybody in the group is from this area, but the Sacramento Area Youth Speaks program does a great job of pushing into classrooms. They go into English classrooms, they work with students, they're doing fabulous work. So time really is a variable. Technology has to move to the center, folks. We have to stop pretending that these notions are, these devices are a distraction. That's our catch-all phrase for anything we don't want to do. You know, people used to tell me, I talk about single gendered school. Now, I don't have anything against them. I just want to know what's your rationale. But when you tell me your rationale is, oh, the other gender is a distraction. I taught middle school. Having a window is a distraction, okay? Because they look out the window and daydream. We've got to move these technologies to the center. Because of these technologies, kids don't have to be absent anymore. We should be archiving what we teach so that kids can go back and review and see what they missed. We just need to move. Before COVID, the technology was just, oh, send that person here because my email's not working. Or send that person here because I can't get my PowerPoint to go. No, they need to be sitting at the table as we do curriculum planning and organizing. Can't be an add-on. And the fourth thing I think we learned is that schools have a role to play in students' basic needs. The very first thing most school districts did in COVID was figure out how to feed people. So think about not just putting those lessons on the shelf, but how do we leverage them as we prepare a new generation of teachers? I'm going to wrap up by sharing with you an example of what I think of as a student example of a kind of culturally relevant approach.
Neighborhoods are ovens with windows. And as the knob on global warming increases, lives are preheated until a soul souffles. Pancake stack projects are poured over with a humid as thick as molasses. Heat and humidity are the perfect appetizer on death's plate. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet from May to October, and senior citizen discount is every day. If thermometers can measure temperatures, they should be able to measure human anxiety. As the temperature rises, we reach boiling points. Attitudes of those around us rise quicker than mercury, and the pressure of staying cool causes us to explode. Compressed living complexes circulate heat and cause compressed feelings to converge upon our neighbors in the hood. So that 90% release of excess body heat talked about in science class is contributed to our local temperature rising. We crack open fire hydrants until we hear lights crying, raising taxes by lowering our body temperature. And if you couldn't afford a wind replacer, fridges and freezers were propped open until your two brothers' faces are frozen. Audiences applaud the ice cream man once that familiar jingle mingles with our ears. This sweet release of flooded heat is a godsend. But what do you know? The ice cream vendor's name is Noah. As the temperature rises, so do attitudes, death rates, bills, and ice cream stocks. Heat affects the elderly more than it does us. Their lungs resemble the Dow Exchange, rises and drops until they crash. Ambulances are summoned, riding down the street flooded with the contents of the only fire hydrant. And we have only just begun to fry.
Now, why is that culturally relevant? Well, clearly he showed that he's learned something about climate change. He also brought his community, his culture into this description. That is his neighborhood in Milwaukee. And the cultural consciousness that's displayed here is that he's asking questions about the disparity. The climate change is impacting his neighborhood more than it's impacting, say, the suburban communities of Brookfield or Whitefish Bay, if you know anything about the Milwaukee area. I love this particular example because I actually had the extreme pleasure of teaching Elijah. This video is actually about 8 years old, so he's out of school now. But this is a young man who got a degree in environmental sciences. He works in climate change, and on the weekends, he still does spoken word. He had the opportunity to experience a culturally relevant education, and we're very proud of the work that he's doing.